All right, good morning, everyone. Reminding people in the room, they're getting their coffee and tea and biscotti, and at home, you have your own. My name is Jennifer Turner, and I direct the China Environment Forum. I've been here 25 years. I just got my little little globe to testify that fact. And I've often said that I have the best job in DC that focuses on China. Not only because I get to work with these cool three women, but that working with NGOs, government, researchers, scientists from around the world. And I don't just work on China. It's U.S.-China climate has been in the DNA of our project, but increasingly we're looking at China's role overseas in promoting or hindering the clean energy transition in the global south. As you know, thank you all for coming and tuning in. You saw today's topic, what's next for U.S.-China climate relations? And I'm guessing a lot of people in the room, you must know that this used to be the most fruitful area of collaboration. And it was kind of like climate diplomacy, but I like to remind people that it wasn't always just climate. National parks, water pollution, chemical standards, illegal wildlife trade, that there was a whole gamut of topics that came in with it. Yeah, we could list the whole thing. But so it was an area that fostered bilateral collaboration back in the Obama administration on EVs, renewables, cleaner coal, building energy efficiency, laid the groundwork for the U.S.-China climate agreement in 2014, which led to Paris climate agreement. So I'm not going to go too much because today, my speakers, they're going to give you the pulse on U.S.-China climate relations in terms of cooperation, coordination, competition in the climate space. Right? It's there. But that actually existed back in the Obama administration. Race to the top. All right, so we've got Joanna Lewis is going to be kicking us off today. And your title's getting longer, my friend.
Sorry.
That's okay. No, but it's good. It's good. I've known you. I met you when you were a PhD at Berkeley. She's the Provost Distinguished Associate Professor of Energy and Environment and Director of the Science, Tech, and International Affairs Program at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. She's over 2 decades of experience in working on international climate and clean energy policy, and she's focused on China. Georgetown, she also runs the Clean Energy and Climate Research Groups and leads several dialogues facilitating U.S.-China climate exchange. So she's going to give us some of the history, the background, because maybe not everyone knows, because I've realized that people have come into D.C. since the Obama administration. All right. Then next we've got Cecilia Springer, who's a non-resident senior fellow with the Global China Initiative at Boston University Global Development and Policy Center. She is a principal at Global Efficiency. She is the principal at Global Efficiency Intelligence, leading research on industrial decarbonization. She also focuses on the environmental impact of China's overseas investments, and that's how I got to know you. Actually, you were a Wilson Center China fellow. You were. I'm lucky. All right, and then wrapping it up today. You're gonna talk about exactly those topics: the industrial decarbonization and a little bit on China overseas. And Kate Logan is the director of the China Climate Hub and Climate Diplomacy at the Asia Society's Policy Institute. She's also, you have a third hat there, I love this, a fellow at the Center for China Analysis. See, women lifting their load here. Her work focuses on enhancing climate progress across Asia and especially in China. And you've done a lot of work, you're supporting international community's engagement with China's climate agenda. So, all right, you're gonna be talking a little bit more about China overseas, and just let you know that this is, okay, you guys ready? There are no PowerPoints today. Going old school, talking, which means that you in the audience and also online are involved in a conversation. So we'll start with the opening comments with Joanna.
Great, thank you so much, Jennifer. It's always a pleasure to be back here and to share the stage with such distinguished panelists. So, this is obviously a challenging time right now in Washington for those of us who work on climate change, and the U.S.-China climate relationship is certainly not going to be insulated from, sort of the political headwinds. But I thought I would just sort of start us off by kind of reminding us of the history on all of this. I'm not here to talk about my book, but I wrote a book that looks at several decades. Jennifer was nice enough to bring it. Several decades of cooperation with China in the clean energy and climate space across multiple countries, but the United States in particular, And so I think it's useful at a moment like this for us to kind of look at the past and think about sort of how we've weathered these sorts of political headwinds previously, and then what we might expect, and where we might be able to find opportunities for continued engagement with China. I mean, I'm of the feeling that we need to find ways to continue to engage with our Chinese colleagues on climate change. I don't think I need to tell anyone in this room that there really is no global solution to climate change without the United States and China playing an active role. And so even if we see parts of the United States, stepping back, it certainly won't be the entire country, and we'll talk more about the different stakeholders involved. And then, of course, China has an increasingly important role to play globally as well. I think when you look back over the last few decades, U.S.-China climate cooperation has had its highs and lows, right? This, as Jennifer mentioned, has often been an area where, we can sort of talk to China even when we don't agree on a lot of other topics, but that doesn't mean that everything has sort of always been rosy, even in the climate and energy space. I look in the book at sort of, the number of agreements that the United States and China have signed in the climate and energy space over the last several decades, and it's, gone up and down. We, of course, saw the highest number of agreements during the Obama administration that was ever signed by any U.S. Presidential administration with China on climate and energy. That really peaked in 2010 with all the agreements that were signed back then on renewables, efficiency, the U.S.-China Clean Energy Research Center, et cetera. But then, even during the Bush administration, I actually started working, on U.S.-China engagement in the early 2000s, and when President W. Bush was in office, and there was actually quite a lot happening in the energy space, in particular, in terms of U.S.-China engagement. It might surprise you, during a Republican administration, an administration that had said they weren't going to join what was then the Kyoto Protocol, in the sort of the years preceding Paris, but even then, they were very keen to engage with China, particularly on energy efficiency, as well as on sort of reducing emissions in the fossil energy space. So we saw quite a lot of activity there. A lot of bilateral engagement, a lot of large-scale dialogues. Delegations going back and forth between Beijing and Washington. I used to work with the China Energy Group at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, and a lot of their work, really was really just getting off the ground during that time, and a lot of really deep engagement in the research and technical space as well, that I think has really set the groundwork for where we are today. Important sort of cooperation on everything from energy efficiency standards, to the beginning of cooperation on renewables. So, I think during the last Trump administration, we can, of course, we can remember what happened in the U.S.-China climate space during that time. And, of course, there wasn't much. There were no new agreements signed during those 4 years on climate and energy, between the United States and China. But there were some bilateral efforts that had begun during the Obama administration that were actually allowed to continue, that they were not stopped altogether. Of course, the most important one being the U.S.-China Clean Energy Research Center. This was really the flagship bilateral agreement during the Obama years. This was, a multi-stakeholder public-private partnership that involved hundreds of researchers, companies, officials from both countries. And that went through 2020. So that, persisted through the Trump years, and was able to, continue to do constructive cooperation and engagement, even as the sort of broader U.S.-China relationship was growing more tense, outside of the climate sphere. So, I think in terms of what we might see this time around in the Trump administration, we've already, of course, President Trump's already withdrawn from Paris on Monday. And there's several other executive orders, if you've read through them, that say, really kind of go against international cooperation writ large. And I think some of the energy-focused executive orders, which are more domestically oriented, do give us a sense of sort of where the administration's energy priorities lie. And it's not all just drill and, explore. There's certainly a lot of that in there, but, there's a focus on energy efficiency. mentioned quite a bit, which is of course positive. Efficiency is, it's somewhat technology neutral, right? So it allows you to continue to use fossil fuels, but it's sort of good for everyone to use less fuels for, you save money, it's better for energy security. So I think that is an area, of course, that's been a huge focus of cooperation and engagement with China, and where China really has advanced quite substantially. Also, carbon capture, utilization, and storage. This is, of course, a hugely important technology for a place like China, really, still very much a coal-based energy system. This is one area where, even during the Biden administration, where there was not a lot of science and technology cooperation happening, most of our climate cooperation during the Biden administration was focused more on non-CO2 greenhouse gases and sort of electricity systems issues, as opposed to actual technology cooperation. But there was technology cooperation being run out of DOE on CCUS. That was sort of one area the United States and China could agree, at least for a few years. So, these, again, could be areas where I think there's some question. Certainly the U.S. is going to continue to prioritize in these areas. And so even I think if we're not engaging directly with China, in a bilateral dialogue, like the climate change working group that we saw previously, I do think that there's other ways that we continue to engage in this area, and we can talk more about this. But I think, in particular, beyond the sort of bilateral relationship and the official Track 1 relationship, I think we always have to remember there are so many other ways that the United States and China are engaging on climate change and clean energy issues, right? Outside of just the State Department or, the federal agencies. And so we're certainly going to see a lot of that engagement, much of which was really set up actually during the first Trump administration, a lot of Track 2 dialogues, partnerships with research institutes, subnationals, private sector. Those are now sort of ready to be, for sort of redeployed. A lot of them actually continued through the Biden years because I think there was still a real need for Track 2 engagement, even as the Track 1 was happening. Not everything was being covered there. So, I do think that, and we can talk more about this in detail, as we continue the conversation. As Jennifer said, I don't want to talk too much. I want this to be kind of open conversation. But, I do think that there will be some interesting opportunities for the U.S. and China to engage sort of indirectly through multilateral and trilateral processes. There's been, of course, a lot of engagement through the multilateral development banks, where sort of U.S. and China play important roles, particularly in financing infrastructure, clean energy infrastructure in developing and emerging countries. Of course, China is playing a huge role there, as Cecilia and others will talk about. But I think as the United States has tried to think more about its strategy in these third countries and how it could sort of leverage what China's doing towards cleaner sources of energy as opposed to large-scale fossil projects, this is something that could still continue, again, through the sort of the MDBs and other multilateral actors where the United States still plays a role. And then, the last area I will mention is the sort of the Track 2 and subnational space, right? And I think now that you may have missed this, but right before Christmas, the U.S.-China Science and Technology Agreement was renewed. It was under negotiation for the last few years and sort of being temporarily renewed, and then it actually fully expired. And then they sort of slipped the renewal, through right before the holiday when no one was sort of watching the news cycle. Because there's political sensitivities, I think, on both sides. But now that it's there and it's, in effect, this does make people feel a little more comfortable, at least at the moment, on the research side in terms of, doing actual research cooperation in universities, national labs. And there's a lot of work that's ongoing, and there's, really been a green light to do this, over the last couple of years. So I think that's a space that will be important to watch, particularly in China, given the influence that academics there have on the policy process, sometimes more than here. And so I see it as a valuable place to engage.
Great. Wow. That was a great summary of a lot of time between the U.S. and China cooperation. Just want to flag one thing that we can talk about more in the Q&A is that, and you hinted at it, some of the people who participate in the Track 2 is a lot of U.S. and Chinese NGOs, think tanks, scientists that are involved, and it's kind of been like the constant that I think had kind of a stabilizing impact over time. All right, Cecilia, you can bring us up, you could bring us down, just wherever you want to take us.
Great,
Oh, and want
thank
to also remind people online, if you have questions, there's a widget underneath the streaming for you to ask that question. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. It's great to be here and with an excellent panel. I think Joanna talked a lot about cooperation, the history of U.S.-China climate cooperation, and I want to talk a little bit about the idea of climate competition. You know, things in a competitive frame, but that still benefit the climate. And that's because we're not in a great era for cooperation. So last year, Joanna and I published a paper on opportunities for U.S.-China engagement on overseas renewable energy development, especially through the lens of development finance. And we had started writing it, I think, the year before. So it was a different era in terms of cooperation and U.S.-China relations. And so I kind of want to update some of those takeaways as I talk today. But I think one good framing that our paper had was this idea of climate impact and the amount of coordination required to achieve a climate policy. So, you know, we kind of hypothesized that a climate policy might have more impact if there were more coordination between the US and China. But right now we're in a very low coordination and low impact era of US-China climate relations. And so how can we still you know, achieve some wins on the climate is potentially through a competitive lens. Now everything with China is about competition, and why not climate as well? What are things that the US and China can do in parallel in a kind of race to the top manner? And I think there could be two areas where there's potential for productive competition. One is climate and development in the global south, which I'll kind of give a high-level overview, and I think Kate may talk more about that. And you know, implementing it, and then also industrial decarbonization, manufacturing, and competitiveness. So starting with climate and development in the global south, we know that you know, countries around the world have huge demand for finance and investment in infrastructure as they develop, and many countries are looking to both the US and China for this support. Of course, China has been the one stepping up to the plate in recent years. Just in the energy sector, electric power, China's provided 3 times the amount of overseas power generating capacity than the US in terms of development finance power generation capacity. And they've just outstripped development finance. China's Belt and Road Initiative has deployed hundreds of billions of dollars since 2008, with the US being far, far behind, to the extent that even is a competition. But that's not to say that US support wouldn't be welcomed in these countries. I do think under the previous administration, there was interest and awareness in the US offering a credible alternative to China's overseas infrastructure development model, and one that could be focused on, for example, cleaner infrastructure and transparency and things like that. But implementation had not necessarily gotten off the ground yet. But there was interest, and I think you know, some examples were the U.S. Partnership on Global Infrastructure and Investment and the Just Energy Transition Partnerships that the U.S. and the International Partners Group struck with South Africa, Indonesia, Vietnam, and Senegal. And then on the Chinese side, I think there was also interest in leadership as, you know, global climate-friendly infrastructure leadership. There was an announcement in 2021 of no longer funding coal plants overseas, as well as China's Green Investment and Financing Partnership that was announced in 2023. So I think there was beginning to be this race to the top, but how far that goes remains to be seen. Of course, in the past few days, we've seen that the U.S. is suspending overseas you know, development aid. The U.S. may no longer have the ambition to lead in global development, but that's not to say this could be an area to be advocated for under the current administration. I think there could be some opportunities for supporting export credits for U.S. manufacturers and products. There is a very short list of green technologies where I think the U.S. leads China in terms of you know, ability to manufacture at scale. I think some examples are industrial heat pumps, thermal energy storage. These are newly commercial technologies that can support electrification of process heating in the industrial sector. These should be, you know, easy wins for receiving support to access global markets. And I've even talked to U.S. manufacturers who would like to do so. I I think we also need to have a conversation about the U.S. Exports of liquefied natural gas. This has been flip-flopping from one administration to the next, but the U.S. is a natural gas economy, and we need to, I think, better interrogate what might be the climate costs or benefits of doing so. Of course, upstream methane emissions, leakage during the natural gas transportation process could completely negate climate benefits, but there is also a way to manage them. So switching now to industrial decarbonization and competition.
Bring your mic a little closer.
A little closer, okay. Switching now to industrial decarbonization and potential climate competition in this area. I think it's also been a interesting few days in terms of dismantling of the Inflation Reduction Act, which was meant to revitalize U.S. manufacturing and especially green manufacturing. But that being said, even in the worst case scenario, I do think the U.S. will still have what we can call a carbon advantage in manufacturing. Again, because the U.S. is a natural gas fueled economy, and our electricity is lower carbon intensity than China's electricity, which still mostly comes from coal. And then we also, directly burn natural gas for many types of lighter manufacturing. And that it's also going to be hard to stop the momentum on renewable energy, even despite recent announcements. Solar made up 60% of all new generating capacity additions in the U.S. last year, and Texas and Florida were the top states adding solar capacity. So, there are certain materials like steel and aluminum where the U.S. has very low carbon intensity of production for the reasons that I mentioned. And all of this is getting attention as a way to compete with China. What are we good at in terms of manufacturing? It's not scale anymore, but we do have this carbon advantage. And I think there's growing awareness of that and potential receptivity in the new administration. But China could challenge this carbon advantage for certain products in the next 5 to 10 years. Even though China is currently very carbon intensive, things are moving quickly. Of course, China is the world leader in installing renewable energy. China also has much more ambition to decarbonize its domestic industries, like steel, for example. So how do we potentially promote this U.S. carbon advantage as a way of, engaging in dialogue with the current administration? I think you may have heard about certain policies on carbon border adjustment mechanisms, CBAMs. I know Jennifer doesn't like acronyms, so I'll try to spell it out. The European Union currently is in the process of implementing a carbon border adjustment mechanism, and there are several proposals in Congress to also enact fees on pollution-intensive imports of materials like steel and aluminum, including the Foreign Pollution Fee Act by Senator Cassidy, Louisiana. So CBAM policies, I think, are very interesting. I think we'll see those and potentially more introduced in the next year or so. I think an important point from a climate policy perspective is that they're not necessarily going to lead to huge emissions reductions in the U.S. Actually, the U.S. doesn't import a lot of steel from China relative to our partners in Canada and Mexico, but it's a very important market signal, both for lower carbon products as well as, supporting U.S. manufacturing. And I think that is going to continue to be a goal of the current administration. We heard the word manufacturing mentioned a lot in the inauguration speeches. So there's bipartisan momentum, I think, on this. You wouldn't call it a carbon border adjustment mechanism here. It's more about pollution fees and that kind of language, but it is focused on the carbon content of manufacturing and our advantage, so-called advantage in doing so. And I think additional policies to keep an eye on are green public procurement and green private procurement policies. So this gets down to subnational actions, but a number of states in the U.S. have introduced so-called buy clean policies that set thresholds for government procurement of carbon-intensive goods, again, like steel. And, I think there was movement towards federal buy clean policies. It remains to be seen what's going to happen with those, but very important to keep an eye on as a sort of partner policy to carbon border adjustment mechanisms, focusing on domestic supply and demand. There's also green private procurement, and this is outside the realm of policy in one area where I think there will be continued momentum, and I think Kate might talk more about business to business. But a number of companies, like auto companies, are thinking about what if we set a standard for using a certain amount of green steel in our cars and other products. That's just one example. So I think these are areas that will continue to move and that are very much in the sphere of US-China climate competition. You may not call it climate, may not even call it competition, but there are actions that US and China, I think, are both working on that could have climate benefits. So I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Think of your questions here in the room and also there outside. And can you bring the microphone closer to yourself, Kate? Because I got, that's the nice thing about the widget here. They said, could speakers speak into the microphone? Cool. Closer. All right. You ready, Kate?
Great. So I think we have a lot of smart people with deep backgrounds on this issue in the room. So I'll try and maybe just provide some overall framing remarks on sort of a couple key pieces building on what both Joanna and Cecilia brought up, and then open it up. So I think the first piece I'll cover is sort of the overall state of multilateral climate governance and how China's role in that is shifting. Speak a little bit about a couple examples of how that relates to China's involvement in the Global South, especially most recently in terms of some active measures on climate finance and sort of how that's shifting China's posture in terms of its incentives for both competing and cooperating on climate, and then maybe provide some closing remarks just in terms of what this means for US-China engagement on climate going forward, both from a competitive and a cooperative standpoint, given where we are in the current beginning of the Trump administration. So I think the first key point, and this is going to be relatively obvious, hopefully, to people in the room, is that we're in a very different place than we were a decade ago when the Paris Agreement was adopted. So when Paris was adopted, countries then put together their nationally determined contributions and then had to figure out how to go and implement them based on whatever domestic political systems they had. So China has the 5-year planning process, which sets targets and then adopts measures to achieve those targets, whereas in the US, because of the challenges domestically with using regulatory measures to implement climate action through something like a national level carbon price, we shifted our tack and went more toward the industrial policy direction in terms of adopting the Inflation Reduction Act, which basically provides a huge waft of incentives for essentially businesses to invest in climate technologies in the US and trying to onshore production. So basically trying to create that linkage between economic progress and climate progress. The challenge with that vis-a-vis China is that it's a bit ironic in that we are somewhat copying China's model, but China had started a lot earlier. So by the time we got around to adopting the Inflation Reduction Act, the US was already behind China in terms of where we are on key technologies and the economic advantage on things like solar, as well as electric vehicles and wind and batteries for both storage and vehicles. So in terms of what that means for China's incentive to act on climate, around a decade ago, you could potentially argue that China's interest was a bit more from a reputational perspective as China was rising globally in its stature, but the economic imperative now, from a lot of respects, is the strongest incentive for China to continue its action on climate, both domestically, but also in terms of its involvement in the Global South. And you see this playing out in a couple of different ways, especially as developed economies like the US and the EU continue to close their doors to Chinese clean tech products. So recent analysis by one of our senior fellows at the Asia Society Policy Institute, Laurie Milverda, has looked at Chinese exports to the Global South and recently found that around half of China's exports of solar, wind, and EVs now go to the Global South as of 2024, which is a record high share and close to matching exports to developed countries for the first time. And at the same time, if anyone was paying attention to the remarks from Ding Xuexiang, Vice Premier, at the World Economic Forum this week, strong portion of his speech basically focused on how one of the major trends for China's economy is this green and low carbon transformation, and obviously can state some of the statistics in terms of China producing around 70% of solar PV and 60% of wind globally. But overall, this general idea that as developed economies are closing their doors, China is very much looking to the global south. And that's impacting how China is engaging in multilateral climate governance. So in terms of just looking back to a couple examples of what this means in terms of US-China, I think if you look at the model for cooperation traditionally between the US and China that was launched during the Obama era and sort of reignited during the Biden era, it focused on two core pieces. One was trying to achieve some degree of consensus on what were considered to be relatively tense negotiating issues within the multilateral climate negotiations, sort of to spur progress with the idea that if the two largest emitters in the world were in agreement, that could bring other countries on board and sort of solve those issues. And then the second piece was essentially what I oftentimes refer to as parallel cooperation, so adopting a range of different processes for technical policy exchanges in order to attempt to motivate progress toward each country's domestic climate commitments. But I think the shift now in relation to my first point is that the mode in terms of how the broader U.S.-China relationship is impacting on that model for cooperation has shifted. So I think we're in a point where we do need to accept that competition is sort of the dominant mode for U.S. and China engagement, and rather than trying to silo climate cooperation and the role that it plays, sort of acknowledge that competition is here to stay. Both sides can motivate progress in different ways and really rethink what is the role of cooperation within the context of sort of the new dominant mode for the relationship. But I think, going back to one example where all these different factors come together and into play was looking at the way that China engaged most recently at the UN Climate Conference last year in Baku on the negotiations around the new global climate finance. And sort of historically within the UN negotiations, there's been a really strong divide between developed and developing countries based on a framework that was put together in the beginning of the 90s. And unfortunately, within the context of negotiations, that's something that's very hard to shift. And oftentimes, China, on behalf of other developing countries, has sort of leveraged that to argue that they don't have a role to play on something like climate finance globally. But in the context of the negotiations last year, Ding Xuexiang, the official that I just mentioned, China's vice premier, started off the conference at the high-level segment by actively sharing how much climate finance China has been providing and mobilizing for the rest of the world, for developing countries for the first time in a way that was very different than the way they had presented it historically. Basically going to show that China is actually investing on par with developed countries and a couple organizations, including World Resources Institute. I see Shuang in the back of the room here, so giving a lot of credit where credit is very much due, have done tremendous research basically analyzing what these contributions look like, and the figures that Ding Xuexiang put forth basically estimate that China's contribution since 2016 is about 24.5 billion, so more or less on par with that of developed countries. At the same time, China continued to use sort of the same negotiating tactics in terms of needing developed countries to take the lead. But at the end of the day, China is willing to shift its stance and have, for the first time, a couple of areas, including its multilateral contributions, counted toward the way that climate finance is accounted going forward. So I think, this sort of goes to show that U.S. pressure in terms of pushing China to be more open and transparent in conjunction with research and other factors can really shift the way that China is engaging. But I think the other key piece here is that China also has a really strong economic incentive to have its interests sort of solidified in this stance in terms of exports and foreign direct investment and other infrastructural investments in the global south on climate. So I think it's interesting if you take that to sort of compare to where China's gotten to in terms of its position on something like mitigation or reducing emissions in the context of the UN negotiations, where China is still taking a posture that maybe is considered to be less constructive in terms of taking new action or sort of pushing back against where the goals have gotten to. So I think it's sort of an interesting example to show how all these different factors are sort of coming together in practice. So in terms of just a few areas where this has implications for the U.S.-China relationship going forward, I think the key piece to start out with is that the U.S. withdrawal from the multilateral regime will obviously open up even more space for Chinese investment internationally, both in terms of just the clean tech exports, but also in terms of investment through Belt and Road, Global Development Initiative, whatnot, as well. So obviously there's that incentive from the China perspective, but from the U.S. side, I think regardless of where the U.S. persuasion is on multilateral climate, which obviously with the number of executive orders that were walked back earlier this week, it's unlikely that the U.S. will be doing anything meaningful on something like climate finance or through multilateral development banks going forward, but there's still really strong business persuasion for the U.S. to figure out in a couple of areas, for instance, where to invest in technologies where it could leapfrog, such as what Cecilia was referencing, and also from the perspective of carbon border adjustments, I think there's also an incentive to figure out places where the U.S. could work with other developing countries globally so that they benefit from these rather than are harmed by these as they move forward. I think one other piece just to highlight in terms of the broader U.S.-China cooperative model is that, and just sort of closing out on this point, that even though the national level exchanges are basically going to fall off during the Trump administration again, as Joanna referenced earlier, there is resilience to the model, and subnational exchanges still have a very strong incentive to move forward. And this is something that California, for instance, has played a leading role in spearheading, but from the China side, there's strong interest in a relatively robust pipeline of exchanges planned under a number of MOUs that China has already agreed with both subnationals and national level agencies on the China side. If we think about the interest for this, I think it's still the case that climate can play the role of a floor to the overall U.S.-China relationship. I think also there are still business incentives in terms of U.S. having some technologies that the Chinese market is interested in. This is reflected in the fact that last year the U.S.-China Commerce Working Group still made progress on certain environmental technologies, so things like technologies for methane capture, where U.S. has actually been doing quite a bit of work that are desperately needed in China as it moves forward on implementing its domestic commitments. And I think that, this sort of is an opportunity on one hand to figure out how to institutionalize that framework for subnational non-state cooperation in a way that can then be hopefully leveraged if, the national level exchanges and cooperation does pick back up again. So maybe I'll leave it there for now. There's lots of bits and pieces to pick up on, but looking forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Great. First, before we go into the question, can we applaud these three women for nailing it in a half hour? So we just like this fire hose of information. I think, but it's good. I want to ask one question that actually has come in. There's a Javier Gracia, a reporter, didn't say which media outlet, kind of asked something that I was thinking with your last comment about how, U.S. is withdrawing from climate action and talking about what opportunity does this give China to have a bigger presence in regions such as Latin America in specific, like with the lithium triangle, et cetera. And I don't know which of you might want to add, because I think there's interest, and maybe in the room too, about diving deeper in specific areas. And I'm going to toss one thing in, not Latin America. We just have a blog that came out that's a kind of what I see as kind of a newer model that China's deploying, like in electric vehicles, instead of just selling them. I mean, in Thailand, they've actually created joint ventures because the Thais are like, we want to get in on the battery and the vehicle tech. And this is a new development, I think, and I'd like. Maybe I've missed it and it started earlier, but it's quite significant that it's BYD because the markets have closed. So that's one concrete example of something happening. But back to the question about Latin America. Anyone? I'm looking at you, Cecilia. Or?
I can.
And make sure bring it close because I want to make sure everyone hears.
I can make an attempt. I do think we've talked about how China is striving to be the leader in terms of being the infrastructure partner of choice. I think this is a big trend in Latin America where China's getting very involved, historically in extractive industries and more recently in utilities, electric utilities and so on, hydropower development. And it is filling a space that opened up as the US kind of stepped back a little bit. And this is a longer term trend. So it's nothing new to see that, and it's not something that this current administration has caused, but China and Latin America have been resource partners for a very long time. It's interesting that you mention critical minerals, or we can call them transition materials. I slightly prefer that term because it's a little bit more expansive and not so militarized. But because there are things, no, seriously, there are things like balsa wood that goes into wind turbines. Yeah. Not just minerals. But this is an area where I think the current administration has expressed a very strong interest in securing supply overseas. And so a perfect example of competition, will it be good competition? I don't know. I think, one thing that we worked on at the Boston University Global Development Policy Center is how to safeguard investments into critical mineral and transition material supply chains. And can there be healthy competition between the US and China to have good standards that protect livelihoods and the environment and so on? And that's also part of showing partner countries that you're a good partner, a preferred partner. So, can there be a race to the top instead of a race to the bottom in these new extractive industries? And I think that remains to be seen. But so we know there's interest in the administration, and how can it be guided towards better outcomes?
Joanna?
Maybe just to add, a bit of sort of broader framing. I mean, one of the sort of alleged focus areas of the Biden administration was on looking for ways to diversify, U.S. clean energy supply chains right around the world, so that we're not so reliant on China. Right now, we're extremely reliant on China in almost all of the crucial clean energy industries. And so, even though we may see less focus during this new administration on clean energy technologies specifically, I think this is something, again, that a lot of companies have already moved in that direction. That ship has sailed. Like they're going to be moving forward on these technologies. And it would really, it's not in the U.S. interest to sort of take, for the next 4 years, to just let China continue to lock up global supply chains in all of the crucial inputs to lithium-ion batteries, electric vehicles, and I don't think that U.S. business interests, will sort of go along with that. So, I think one of the biggest weaknesses of the Inflation Reduction Act was that, it was very U.S.-centered, right, and had a lot of sort of protectionism to encourage manufacturing here, which is great, but, the United States is sort of never going to be in a position to manufacture all the clean energy technologies we need for the low-carbon transition. And so I think there's still this sort of big opening to think about how you're getting other countries, particularly emerging and developing countries in Latin America, Southeast Asia, and elsewhere, to have, actual roles in these supply chains that bring local jobs and, because a lot of them want to be part of these supply chains beyond just extractive industries, right? And of course, the environmental harm that can come with that, right, can be quite damaging. So I do think that this is an area China is going to continue, to engage in. And I think even in this administration, this just has to be an area where the United States in some way is directly engaging, because this is a long-term, interest in these technologies. They have a lot of applications. And so I think we need to be thinking strategically about this.
Okay. Do you have anything to add, or do we open up to
I actually want to
these
pick up
folks?
where Joanna left off with a bit of a more specific point, which is just that something I maybe didn't clarify when I was speaking on Chinese investment internationally is that sort of for the past decade, the focus is a little bit more on state-owned enterprises, but now we're shifting into an era where Chinese commercial players are playing a much stronger role globally. But the fact that the environmental and social performance of these commercial players will be under much greater scrutiny, and wanted to point to a recent example of this with BYD investing in a factory in Brazil. And this sort of goes to Joanna's point of China more so for economic reasons, has been more active in terms of foreign direct investment and manufacturing capacity in other emerging economies globally than the U.S. has, in part because, from one perspective, obviously there's the incentive to try and figure out how to skirt around some of the restrictions from developed economies, but also, there's other economic drivers of this as well. But BYD basically was using essentially forced labor to build this factory, based on my understanding, and that was something that was basically came to light, and there is huge pushback and eventual, I think, resolution of the issue in terms of this example of BYD's poor labor standards in terms of this investment in a factory in Brazil. And I think that's a good example that goes to show that Chinese commercial players still have a long way to go when it comes to the social and environmental standards of their performance globally. That's an opportunity that the U.S. can compete on, right, if we also uphold our own standards in terms of our international investment. But it does take a more concerted strategy in terms of how we're thinking about, providing benefits through, investments that create local jobs in other emerging economies globally, something that I think to a certain extent the Biden administration was thinking about at the end of its tenure. But I think the point there is that there's still a long way to go from that perspective. So even though China is investing more, exporting more, there's certainly a huge gap still from that perspective.
Okay, so I have some here. I'm going to hold some of the questions that they're good, but I want to open up to the room here. So you'll have to speak into a microphone and don't move it out of the order from where it is in the room if you come up. So we'll have one here. I'll gather three questions. Steve and Marguerite. Okay, so just use that mic if you don't mind, and just put it right back when it's done. Sorry, it helps the AV.
Thank you all very much for a very informative.
Oh, and make sure you tell us who you are.
Gregory Kolacki, Global Security Program, Union of Concerned Scientists. Quick follow-up on Latin America and transitional minerals.
You could pick up the mic. I don't want
Okay,
to
great.
follow. I didn't mean that
One-
exclude.
One concern we have in the security program is, of course, military conflict or political conflict between the two countries. And over the transitional minerals issue, is it possible that the response the Trump administration will have to this competition is actual intervention in the domestic politics of supplier countries in Latin America, much like we had during the Cold War? And is this a thing that's talked about in climate circles, this type of competition? And is there any sort of caution in how we frame our acceptance of competition, which I hear from several of the panel members, without accepting that kind of competition?
Okay, all right. So turn that off and hold. And so Steve?
Hi, Steve Wolfson from EPA. These talks were great. Thanks so much. I just wanted to bring up one thing we didn't hear a lot about, but that looms really large whenever we're talking about China and climate change, which is coal, both within China and also China's investments abroad. So I'd be interested in your perspectives on that and if that's starting to turn around or not.
Okay, and Marguerite?
Yes.
Yeah.
Hello, my name is Margarita Balmaceda. I just started as a Wilson Fellow and very excited to learn from the China Environment Forum. So my question goes back to one point Kate and Cecilia talked about carbon border adjustment type measures. And I'm very interested in Kate's point about the fact that such measures, even under different names, perhaps not called carbon adjustment or pollution adjustments, may open possibilities for U.S. cooperation with Global South states. And maybe you could say something more about that, but also how that interfaces with U.S.-China cooperation. And I'm also very curious, how do you see the possibility of such initiatives surviving in the new administration?
Okay, is 3 enough for you guys to keep in your brains? All right, so do you want to start with the last one, since we know that, do you need a minute? Yeah, I don't know, it's always good to start with the last one. Kate?
Sure. And maybe I can speak to the last one, the other question on coal as well. I would say that I don't really have much expertise that I feel qualified to speak to in the first question, although I think it's a very important question. So I think with the carbon border adjustment mechanism, so first of all, I think there is strong bipartisan momentum in the U.S. toward adopting some sort of mechanism. There have been bills put forth by, for instance, Senator Cassidy and Lindsey Graham most recently, focus on this Pollution Fee Act, but also other areas covered as well, such as the Prove It Act, which focus a little bit more on the data side, which also has bipartisan support in basically benchmarking the carbon advantage of goods produced in the U.S. as well as globally. And there are people in the room who could probably speak much more detail about what's included in some of the current initiatives. I think from my perspective, so I mentioned sort of this idea of how do we ensure that partner countries in emerging economies figure out how to invest in their domestic decarbonization such that their export economies can eventually be advantaged by these bills. I think that's one piece. But I think another piece that Cecilia also referenced that's really important is this piece of data. I think you see examples historically of technical cooperation as means of overcoming political barriers, and any sort of carbon border adjustment mechanism will require very robust data and also interoperable data in order to implement. We already have the EU CBAM going forward, and it's basically in this sort of like interim phase where they're submitting data, but not yet actually enacting the fee on top of that. And already it's still quite challenging to get the data piece right. On the China side, what's interesting is domestic actors in China, even though there's strong political noncompliance and a lot of pushback from high-level officials in the multilateral context, if you actually go to China and talk to factories, most of them are basically doing a lot to actually comply on a data level and a technical level with the CBAM. I remember one example of a steel factory in China that said it didn't even really export to the EU at that point in time, but it saw this global trend and was basically still doing the work to try and figure out how to make sure that they could comply with the EU CBAM requirements. I think from a U.S. perspective, there is a strong incentive to also figure out how to participate effectively in the data side, whether it's through capacity building or other means, in part because the more data there is internationally from a carbon perspective, the more monitoring and supervision there can be more broadly toward carbon progress and decarbonization. And I think that the U.S. does have a significant technical advantage if you look back at some of the work that we've done with our federal agencies and other countries on this. So I think that's one area that I would emphasize for cooperation. And then just quickly on the coal one, maybe, I think 2 points. I think in terms of coal, there's two pieces, right? So there's China investing in coal internationally outside its borders and then domestically. The domestic piece is the part that keeps one up at night, right? Because China is responsible for vast majority of the world's remaining coal-fired power plants and new builds as well. From an international perspective, so in 2021, Xi Jinping stepped up and made this commitment to build no more new coal internationally. And I would say that commitment has more or less been upheld. There was always sort of expectation that there would be a loophole for projects that had already been approved. Those are moving, many of those are moving forward. Some of those have been canceled. I think the biggest loophole right now is for captive coal, which is basically coal plants that are on site at industrial parks or factories, many of which are invested in by commercial players on the China side. And this goes back to my point on BYD in Brazil. And one clear example of that is in Indonesia, where Chinese are investing massively in nickel processing and powering that with new coal-fired power plants, captive coal. And that's somewhat ironic because the end product is going to be used ostensibly for like clean products. So I think that's one area. Domestically, it's really challenging. I think there are obviously a lot of energy security and geopolitical security concerns on the China side. I think that said, in terms of getting China to commit to no more new coal domestically, if you look at the pipeline of plants that they've approved from a technical perspective, they don't need more new coal. But politically, that support and that momentum is not there yet. And I think there is a really interesting window of opportunity to see how to basically shift the politics so that that commitment can be made. So maybe I'll leave it there.
Cecilia, do you want to take any of that?
Sure. I guess just to continue the conversation on coal, which Yes, I love to talk about coal. I think it is helpful to divide this into the domestic coal use in China and the overseas. And I think, like Kate said, there's been leadership and momentum, positive steps forward on China's overseas support for coal plants, which previously were a very, contentious issue and one that received a lot of attention. But I do think it's important to point out, even with this ban on the new coal plants, that there are Chinese-financed plants around the world that are going to continue to operate for decades. So the median age of an overseas coal plant financed by China is about 15 years, so built in 2006 or 2007. So they're middle-aged, but we know that coal plants around the world need to retire by 2040, according to the International Energy Agency, to achieve our Paris Agreement climate targets. So what to do about these coal plants, I think, is in part up to China as an invested interest through debt and equity finance in these plants. And it's also going to be dependent on host country policies, and that's where we're seeing discussions about early retirement of coal plants are starting to emerge. So I think while there have been policy wins, let's not forget about that existing fleet of coal plants. I think on the domestic coal, there's a great analysis out there from the Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air on, month-to-month coal consumption, and everybody's watching to see, when does it peak, because that's also going to drive China's overall emissions peaking. But just some interesting stats, 1/3 of coal used in the world and, in the last year or so goes to power plants in China, and about 1/10 goes to steel production in China, and more for other industries. So in the end, I believe China consumes about 50% of the world's coal and is also producing about 50% of the world's coal. So, the global, ongoing reliance on coal is really a China story. And so Kate talked a little bit about the politics of that, but, coming back to the U.S. relationship, what can the U.S. do or offer, even technology-wise, to move beyond coal in China? I think we've talked a little bit about some of that, technologies, even fuels like natural gas, but I think that should be part of the conversation.
Joanna?
Just to add a quick point on that, I think this is a really important time if you're following the international climate negotiations, right? Because countries are supposed to be submitting their next round of their nationally determined contributions, their targets or pledges under the Paris Agreement by February. And, a real concern, I think, is what China's target's going to look like, right? Because, and it's very much tied to what's happening domestically on coal, because as you may recall from China's first NDC, they said they would peak their emissions before 2030. It's 2025 now, right? And it's looking like coal hasn't peaked. We're still kind of analyzing the 2024 data, but it did go up, it looks like, on, overall. And although, again, the data has sometimes changed, so we'll see. But until you see a real peak coal, not just in power, right, but across the board, as Cecilia mentioned, like, you can't get a full, a peak in CO2 emissions or even greenhouse gas emissions, and then you have to start to get China on this path for the 2060 carbon neutrality goal, which is going to require very sharp reductions, from 2030 to 2060, and 30%, it may be, and it's looking like that's not going to be the number that we see in China's NDC. I'm not going to put forward a crystal ball, but it's a tricky time for China to sort of play this role, even though there was a lot of pressure from the United States in sort of the waning weeks of the Biden administration to make sure that if China doesn't put forward a strong target, that, the fate of the Paris Agreement is sort of in China's hands, right? I don't know if we want to put that kind of pressure on China. And I don't know if that kind of diplomacy is helpful necessarily, right? Because there's a lot of real domestic challenges that China's energy system is facing. So anyway, I worry, this will be something to really watch for in the next few weeks, what that looks like, what kind of signal that sends to the rest of the world. Of course, the United States has withdrawn, but, Argentina has also shown signs of potentially withdrawing. This could, potentially set off a chain of events whereby countries that are sort of not happy with all aspects of the Paris Agreement, if you are, right, it's a work in progress, may decide that sort of they want to use this moment in time to leverage whatever they're asking for and actually use withdrawal sort of as a tool behind that.
Did one of you want to, did you want to touch on the first question? I mean, I think we're doing a lot more on transitional minerals here, and I don't know if it's.
I mean, I'll just say I don't think that, that this is, I can only speak, it's not my area, I can only speak for what I hear about, but I haven't heard a lot of talk about direct conflict over critical minerals, harkening back to Cold War era type competition. I think typically when you hear about risk of conflict, we're talking about Taiwan, South China Sea, sort of territorial issues. I don't know if others have heard about this issue.
But China has control of most right now. But we can, if you don't mind, the Wilson Center, the Environmental Change and Security Program, we're doing a lot more on on these transitional materials. So more to come.
I think the communities that bear the burden of conflict are the local communities. It's not about the U.S. and China, I think, in those cases, yeah.
It's a good point. All right, 3 more questions. Raise your hand high. Okay, here, there. Maybe I'll do 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. The people who had their hands up. All right. And short questions, and no comments or minimal comments.
Sure. My name is Victor Ning. I'm with the China Global Television Network. I just wanted to ask about AI. What do you think, or how do you think AI is going to change the dynamic of either cooperation or competition between China and the U.S., given that it's a strategic priority for both countries and it's very energy intensive in its development? Thank you.
Okay, that's one. Next one, you have to hand her the microphone so she stands up. Just real quick, yeah. Just.
Hi, Annie Zhou with the Asian Development Bank. So it came up in the conversation that we're very well expected to see the U.S. to step down from, at least take a step back from multilateral climate corporations, even though private business interests will still persist. But there are areas where private business interests might not be able to reach, like the unbankable projects in fragile and conflict-prone areas. So I'm wondering if you see China to step into the vacuum to take the lead into multilateral efforts, or if the U.S. will ramp up bilateral support in those areas. Thank you.
Pass to the next gentleman.
Hi, Frank Schwing. I'm a retired climate scientist. What will be the role and influence of our traditional trading partners in the Pacific Rim as we move forward? I'm thinking specifically China, Korea, Australia, some of the countries you haven't mentioned yet.
So the role of them in this.
How will they impact going forward in terms of both development, production, and consumption
Of
technologies?
technology, okay. All right, and then there was one more right there at the table.
Hi, I'm Pam Stein, and I am a Wilson Center scholar. Competition and cooperation is divergent. In light of China-U.S. relations, what recommendations do you have for the administration to draft a balanced and sustainable environmental strategy?
Okay. Who wants to grab what? She'll take AI. AI for 10. Ding, ding, ding. And then,
Okay, great. Thank you. That's obviously really excellent questions and very wide-ranging, so we'll do our best to touch on them. I mean, just briefly on the AI question, this is, I think we're still waiting to sort of see how this, these various proposals that have been mentioned by the Trump administration unfold. But I do think it's interesting the amount of attention we've seen, on this topic, and of course there are strategic implications of the use, of AI across a whole variety of industries. And as you rightfully mentioned, this is an area where the United States and China are investing quite a bit. I recently did a study looking at how AI is specifically being used in climate change and clean energy related research and applications, right? And maybe not surprisingly, you find that China is sort of leading in the number of publications and the number, sort of the amount of funding, specifically going into sort of climate change related AI applications, which is really the area that I can speak most to. I mean, there's, as you mentioned, there's an emissions and energy impact, right, associated with increased servers and computing power, but potentially also huge advantages to incorporating a lot of machine learning and other methods into the way that we do climate modeling, which can give us sort of better predictability about extreme events and other impacts. A lot of interesting applications for integrating renewable energy in the grid, for example, which again allows better predicting the wind and the sun and all these sorts of things. So, really fascinating research coming out of China in these areas in particular. They are really ahead of the game. The United States is next, and then EU and Korea, Japan, other countries, also starting to play a role here. But I think that there's sort of the both sides of the coin, right, and the potentially positive impacts to our understanding of how to both the science, but then also how to deploy clean energy, also in efficiency. There's just a lot of applications of a whole variety of tasks and methods, in AI that could have big implications for emissions reduction.
Kate, do you want to hop on? Which one do you want to answer?
Sure. Maybe I'll speak to the question around China and multilateral development banks. So I think referencing something I mentioned in my opening remarks, it's interesting to note that going forward, China's contributions to multilateral development banks will be counted under this new framework for global climate finance under the UN. And if you look at China's contributions, so in comparison to its bilateral lending, which actually sort of peaked around 2017 and has been declining, although it's picking back up again, and there's strong incentives for it to increase over time, its contributions to multilateral development banks have also been actually more steadily increasing. So from 2013 to 2016, they're around 0.5 billion, but then the data shows that they've grown from around 1.2 billion in 2017 to around 4 billion in 2022. So it's an area where China is playing a increasing role. I think at the same time, we can probably expect, as you referenced, the U.S. to play a much less active role, if any role at all, over the next 4 years, at least in the near term. I think this is an opportunity for China to figure out how to step up and play a more active, constructive role from that perspective. But I think, there's also the question of the broader reforms to the multilateral financial system and architecture, and an open question as to whether the U.S. will just sort of take a step back and not necessarily block anything versus, actively trying to disrupt that process, which is actually critical for increasing the amount of climate finance available globally. So I think that that's certainly an area to watch for going forward. So there's a lot of issues at play there, but I think overall there is a strong hook for China to play a more active role. But I think another area that's really critical from an MDB perspective is just finance for adaptation, which is basically projects that help countries adapt to climate impacts rather than reduce emissions, which is mitigation. And that's something that there really is not much of a business incentive, although in some cases more so for private sector investments directly, and you really do need concessional or grant-based finance on adaptation. So I think that's another area to watch as well.
Someone, do you have something you want to take on?
Yeah, if it's okay, I'd like to also talk about AI a little bit, and then maybe if there's time about our trade partners. I think on the AI side, personally, I have yet to see a really compelling use case for AI to transform, decarbonization or climate action. I think, we've seen small things that AI could be deployed for, like energy management or so on, but I think there remains a big question about how it could really accelerate the climate or energy transition, which leaves the concern about its energy footprint. The US has more data centers than any other country in the world, by far, more computing capacity. And we see massive increase in the number of data centers over the next 5 to 10 years. We actually have a report about this coming out soon. So I think that for the energy and emissions footprint of US data centers, renewable energy is the key. So a lot of these big tech companies that are developing hyperscale data centers, they also have renewable energy procurement targets and goals, and some of them are making progress, but it's going to be challenging because electricity demand is going to increase so much that supply may face some constraints, especially in certain geographies like Northern Virginia, our country's data center alley. So when we hear Trump say that there's a massive energy shortage and we need to drill, baby drill, I think we know that that's not true for most things, but we do need to think about our electricity system and, you know, eking out efficiency gains from improved transmission investments and so on. And if we do have new capacity, it has to be renewable for these data centers. We've also seen, you know, nuclear plants being recommissioned in order to meet this electricity demand, like 3 Mile Island. And on the China side, likewise, you know, they have massive renewable energy capacity, and are they going to link this to data centers? You know, I don't know, but I think that has to be the path forward for the emissions impacts of data centers. I think maybe briefly on the trade partners, because we didn't really talk about it. You know, I think that some of the policies that I talked about earlier, like green public procurement, decarbonization of steel and so on, these are actually very salient issues for Korea and Japan as well, which are major steel producers, automakers, and so on. And so I think actually some of the same structural issues that China faces in transitioning away from coal, and some of the same policy opportunities like green public and private procurement actually apply to these countries as well, and are something that the US has ongoing dialogue about. I think it remains to be seen. I also don't have a crystal ball, you know, how those dialogues will continue under the new administration, but certainly there's, you know, there have been existing channels.
Okay, we're bumping up against the time, but I want to have everyone here to kind of talk maybe along your lines about some of the recommendations. But what's really, say, a little self-serving. Today's meeting helped me set an agenda for things that we could explore as we move forward in our conversations here. And I did get a few things on here, just if it could be part of your comments or not, about wanting a little bit more information about the subnational and maybe other areas. So maybe, I mean, I'm going to toss in an idea just of like, it's both subnational and an area of focus. We have a project that we started 2 years ago here called Cool Agriculture, looking at greenhouse gas emissions from food and agriculture. Globally, it's 31% of all greenhouse gas emissions. And we have our first initial roadmap, which talks about things that we do not think are highly confrontational between the two countries. Food waste. U.S. and China, we are superpowers in food waste. And right before the end of the last administration, in the Sunnylands Agreement, at the climate talks, the U.S. and China did come together, and they actually did slot food waste as being an area for collaboration. That is, inherently, there are national things that can happen, but also very much handled at the subnational level. So I'm throwing food waste on the table, but there's also, that sounds bad, but also soil sequestration, rice emissions, things that matter for both food security, labor, and greenhouse gases. But it doesn't have to, you don't have to lead with climate. It's, you know, and it was a big part under the Biden administration on, you know, climate smart agriculture. Okay. Recommendations, final comments, bring us up, bring us down, whatever.
Well, this has been a great conversation. So I'm going to take that prompt, use an opportunity to promote a paper that I just published today at the, what is it, the PEN, what do we call it? The PEN Project on Future of U.S.-China Relations. And I have a paper looking at really how the U.S. can better compete with China and the clean energy industry sort of in the current political framing that we're in now. I think you know, there are ways right now, you know, a lot of the policy coming out of the Biden administration has been about excluding Chinese clean energy firms completely from the U.S. market, right, in sort of all capacities. And there's, of course, been real rationale behind that. But I do think we need to be a little bit more strategic about allowing certain types of technology transfers and technology partnerships. This is all, you know, really within the private sector, right? You know, there's just, if we're going to actually have a chance at a globally competitive auto industry in Michigan and beyond, you know, a lot of these companies are actually they're trying to forge these partnerships with Chinese EV and battery companies because that is their only hope of competing globally. And again, these are a lot of small auto parts manufacturers in Michigan and elsewhere are already forging technology transfer partnerships. These can be designed in a way that are in the U.S. interest, where the actual technology from China is being licensed to the United States, and there's it's sort of a win-win for both sides. If we're not going to allow direct competition of Chinese technology, this is a way that indirectly we can at least benefit from the innovation and learning that's happened there, over the past decade. So I would just say that this is an important area, for us to be thinking much more strategically about global supply chains, and then how, if we're going to allow some of that in, how we can then use that to leverage better transparency, better labor standards, in Chinese manufacturing, among the concerns Cecilia's and others talked about.
And we'll put her paper on our website, the link to it, not the whole paper. Okay. Cecilia?
Yeah, I don't think I have any, nicely summarized takeaway other than that, I think the new administration, I think, needs to articulate a compelling strategy for supporting U.S. manufacturing as the IRA is kind of being taken apart. And I think that in developing this strategy, the role of the U.S. and China need to be carefully taken into account, looking at the different structures of each economy, the different areas that each country leads in. I think that needs to be understood, and also, a part of whatever this new strategy is going to be. It has to be more than just taking away incentives and enacting tariffs. And I think, one more small thing that we didn't talk about, or at least not talk about a lot, is on U.S.-China cooperation is methane, or natural gas, as you may call it. Previously there was this methane working group under the, sort of official U.S.-China climate cooperations over the past few years. I don't know exactly what's going to happen to it, but I think there's also a case to be made to this administration about, working together, even if it's about, increasing U.S. exports of natural gas or something that, losing methane through leakage is just wasteful. It just doesn't make sense from an economic perspective. And it's also a not necessarily direct competition thing. The sources of methane emissions in the U.S. and China are very different. In China, it's about coal bed methane emissions that are escaping, and in the U.S., it's about the leakage and the transport and distribution. And there are also very different monitoring structures and technology, where in China, there's a lot of still just sort of calculating and estimating based on how much you use. Yeah. And then, in the U.S., we have, actual sort of monitoring technologies that are used to some extent. So I think there's area for complementarity here. The discussion has to continue on that.
Okay, Kate, we're giving you a very short wrap-up. Just throw some, even if it's a list, to leave us with where to go.
Yeah, two things. I think, first of all, I do want to give credit where credit's due in terms of the work that the Biden administration did on cooperation. And I think, there is a lot of cynicism toward the value of cooperation in this competitive era. But I think apart from, establishing a floor to the relationship, there were some important, albeit maybe incremental, but very important wins. And I think Cecilia referenced one on methane and other non-CO2 gases in particular. And I think there's value of bringing issues to the table in a way that prompts the other side to think more actively about them. And China did eventually adopt a national methane action plan, took more substantive action to control industrial nitrous oxide emissions, and is actually potentially very close to getting even more progress on that area. And I think that that's something that deserves credit because it was not easy to get there. So even though some of those wins are not necessarily always, visible at a high level, they are really important. And the portion of methane and non-CO2 gases that China is responsible for is absolutely massive internationally. So the fact that China has promised that it will include all greenhouse gases and not just carbon emissions in its next nationally determined contribution will be critical to maintaining progress toward Paris Agreement goals. I think going forward, one of the things that I referenced earlier is just how can some subnational cooperation be more institutionalized and create this framework that can be more self-sustaining going forward. And I think one thing to consider is how to multilateralize subnational cooperation, so bringing in either third partners like US, China, EU, subnational, such that maybe government-to-government dialogues between two of those countries continue, and it's at the subnational in the third country, but if that country comes back to the table, it can be leveraged going forward, or doing so in ways that bring in other countries, which then creates that third, brings in that third country perspective. That's really important. But I think also, again, subnational cooperation, the work that the Biden administration did, they also thought actively about some of the non-state subnational partners who can continue that work on a technical and policy level going forward. So I think there will continue to be important exchanges on some of the key areas like energy transition, methane, non-CO2 gases, circular economy, from some of the partners that have been doing this for decades. And that's something that will be important to remember going forward.
Okay, so what you guys got today, you got a master class on the state of U.S.-China climate relations, where it could, may, couldn't go, and kind of an agenda for my work as well. So thanks for that, people. Applaud for my speakers. And I want to mention everyone, happy Year of the Snake coming up next week, okay? Eat lots of dumplings. Thank you very much.